The first time I realized my daughter-in-law hated having me in their house, she didn't know I was standing in the hallway. The dining room smelled like rosemary chicken and expensive candles Emily only lit when guests came over. Rain pressed softly against the windows while warm laughter drifted through the house in little waves that should have felt comforting. Instead, I stood frozen beside the hallway arch listening to my family discuss me like a problem nobody wanted responsibility for anymore. "It's starting to feel permanent," Emily said quietly. "Not my daughter. My son's wife." Then somebody laughed softly. My son didn't. I stayed completely still. Partly from shock. Partly because something in her voice sounded too practiced. Like this conversation had already happened before tonight. The hallway lights were dim behind me. From where I stood, I could see part of the dining room table through the opening near the staircase. Wine glasses. Birthday decorations. My granddaughter Sophie showing pictures on her tablet while the adults talked over her. I wasn't even supposed to hear this. Daniel had asked me to grab another bottle of wine from the pantry downstairs. That's why I stood halfway between floors holding the railing while my entire understanding of the past 3 years quietly rearranged itself. Emily lowered her voice further. "He's here almost every day now." One of her friends answered carefully. "Well, he did help pay for the kitchen renovation, right?" A strange silence followed that. Then Emily laughed once. Short. Tight. Embarrassed. "That's exactly the problem. He acts like this house still belongs to him." Something inside my chest dropped heavily after that. Because suddenly dozens of tiny moments from the past year started making sense all at once. The uncomfortable silences whenever I arrived unexpectedly. Daniel texting before family dinners asking what time exactly I planned to leave. Emily slowly moving my coffee mug from their cabinet space into the laundry room shelf beside cleaning supplies. At first, I honestly thought she was reorganizing the kitchen. Then I realized nobody else's mugs had moved. Not random. Not imagined. Managed. Then Emily sighed quietly again. Last week he walked into Sophie's piano lesson without knocking. One of the women at the table tried to soften it. "I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it." "I know," Emily said quickly. "But he still has keys. He comes over whenever he wants. And Daniel never says anything." That one hurt differently. Because suddenly I understood this wasn't one uncomfortable conversation. It was resentment that had been quietly growing room by room inside their house while I kept believing I was helping. I gripped the stair railing tighter. 3 years earlier, after Daniel lost his construction business during the recession, I refinanced my own paid-off house to help them avoid foreclosure. I never told anybody except Daniel. Not Emily. Not the grandchildren. Not even Margaret before she passed. Because helping your children wasn't supposed to become emotional debt. At least that's what I believed back then. Then Emily said the sentence that hollowed me out completely. "I just want our house to feel like ours again. Ours. Not families. Not home. Ours." Daniel finally spoke after almost a full minute of silence. And somehow that hurt worst of all. "I know. That was it. Not. He helped us. Not. He saved this house. Not. He's my father. Just. I know." The dining room grew quieter after that. Forks against plates. Soft music from the kitchen speaker. Rain tapping gently against the windows. Normal sounds. Meanwhile I stood alone in the dark hallway realizing something humiliating. Every time I thought I was helping my family rebuild their life, I may have actually been reminding them they once couldn't survive without me. I stayed in the hallway another few seconds after that. Long enough to hear somebody awkwardly change the subject. Long enough to hear silverware against plates and Sophie laughing about something on her tablet while my son quietly said almost nothing at all. Then I walked downstairs and stood alone in the pantry staring at wine bottles I suddenly couldn't remember the names of. My hands actually felt unsteady. Not from anger. Humiliation. There's something uniquely painful about discovering people have been tolerating your presence while you believed you were part of their life. I grabbed the bottle Daniel asked for and stood there another moment trying to pull myself together before going back upstairs. Because now every memory inside that house felt different. Every dinner invitation. Every drop by any time. Every casual conversation in the kitchen. I suddenly wondered how many times Emily smiled at me while secretly wishing I'd leave earlier. By the time I returned to the dining room, everyone had already rearranged themselves emotionally. Too quickly. That told me everything. Emily smiled the moment she saw me. Warm. Polite. Practiced. There you are, she said lightly. We thought you got lost down there. Laughter around the table. Small. Uncomfortable. Daniel wouldn't look directly at me. That hurt more than Emily. Because silence from strangers is normal. Silence from your own son feels deliberate. I placed the wine bottle on the table carefully and sat back down beside Sophie. She immediately leaned against my arm without even looking up from her tablet. Children do that. They love you honestly before adults teach them how relationships become complicated. Emily resumed dinner conversation almost immediately. School schedules. Kitchen remodel delays. Vacation plans for summer. But now I noticed things I somehow missed before. Every time I started speaking, Emily redirected the conversation within seconds. Every time I mentioned helping with something around the house, Daniel answered too quickly. We've got it. Not rude. Worse. Managed. Then Sophie looked up suddenly. Grandpa, are you coming to the lake house with us this summer? The table went completely still. Emily reached for her wine glass too fast. Daniel cleared his throat quietly. And for one terrible second, nobody answered an 8-year-old child because all the adults at the table were busy calculating something silently. That moment told me more than the hallway conversation had. Because people can fake kindness. But hesitation reveals truth faster than words ever will. Finally Emily smiled tightly. We're still figuring out plans, sweetheart. Sophie nodded and went back to her tablet. But I barely heard the rest of dinner after that. Because suddenly I understood something humiliating. They had already started discussing future plans that no longer automatically included me. An hour later, I stood alone in their kitchen rinsing my plate while everyone moved into the living room for cake and presents. I heard Emily's friend whisper quietly near the dining room doorway. You should probably talk to him eventually. Emily answered softly. I know. That phrase again. I know. Not. You're misunderstanding. Not. He's family. Just. I know. I dried my plate slowly and looked around the kitchen. 3 years earlier, I helped install half these cabinets myself. Daniel and I spent 2 straight weekends laying the hardwood floors because contractors had become too expensive after his business collapsed. Back then, Emily cried and hugged me when we finished. Now my coffee mug sat beside laundry detergent in the utility room because apparently I'd started leaving too many traces of myself inside their house. Then Daniel walked quietly into the kitchen. For a second, neither of us spoke. Father and son standing in silence beneath warm kitchen lights while laughter drifted from the next room. Finally he said quietly. You weren't supposed to hear that. Not. She was wrong. Not. I defended you. Just. You weren't supposed to hear it. And standing there beside the sink in the house I once helped save from foreclosure, I realized something painful. Sometimes people don't resent the help itself. They resent the permanent reminder that they once needed it. I stopped coming over unannounced after that dinner. Not immediately. At first I told myself I was simply giving them space. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had started trying to make my presence smaller. Smaller conversations. Shorter visits. Less advice. Less lingering in the kitchen after meals. I even started texting Daniel before driving over. That part hurt my pride more than I expected. Because fathers aren't supposed to schedule permission to see their own family. 3 weeks passed like that. Then one Saturday afternoon Sophie called me directly from her tablet. "Grandpa, are you coming to my recital?" Her voice sounded excited enough that I smiled automatically. "Of course I am." Silence. Then she lowered her voice. "Mommy said maybe it's better if there's less people this time because the room is small." Something cold moved quietly through my stomach. I kept my voice calm. "Oh. But I still want you there." I stared out my kitchen window while rainwater slid slowly across the glass. Children tell the truth accidentally. That's what makes them dangerous during adult conflicts. "What time is the recital?" I asked softly. After we hung up, I sat alone at my table for a long time staring at nothing. Then I noticed something strange. The framed family photo near the living room shelf suddenly looked outdated. Not old. Removed. Like I was looking at evidence from a version of the family that no longer fully existed. That evening Daniel finally called. His voice already sounded tired before the conversation even started. "Dad." I waited. He exhaled heavily. "Emily's just stressed lately." There it was. The universal sentence people use right before asking you to tolerate being treated badly. I stayed quiet. Daniel continued carefully. "She feels like there haven't really been boundaries since we moved into the house." Boundaries. Interesting word. Because suddenly the home I helped save financially had transformed into territory requiring emotional permission to enter. "I have keys because you asked me to help during the remodel," I said calmly. "I know." Again. "Always." "I know." "Never." "You're wrong." "Never." She crossed a line. "Just." "I know." Rain tapped softly against my kitchen windows while Daniel lowered his voice further. "She says sometimes it feels like we never fully became independent." That one landed hard. Because suddenly I understood the real problem. It wasn't the visits. The keys. The coffee mug. The dinners. It was debt. Not financial debt. Emotional debt. Every cabinet I installed. Every mortgage payment I helped cover. Every repair. Every emergency loan. None of it disappeared after the crisis ended. It stayed in the walls of their house reminding them they once couldn't survive without outside help. Daniel spoke again. "She just wants us to feel like we built something on our own." I laughed once quietly. Not because anything was funny. Because 3 years earlier, when the bank was preparing foreclosure paperwork, Emily cried in my driveway thanking me for saving their family. Now the same help had apparently become evidence that I didn't know when to step back. "I'm not trying to control your life," I said quietly. "I know that." But his voice sounded weaker now. Uncertain. Like he no longer fully believed his own explanations. Then I asked the question that had been sitting inside my chest since the dinner party. "Do you want me around less?" Silence. Long enough to answer me before he even spoke. Finally. "I just think maybe things got too dependent for a while." Dependent. Interesting choice of words. Because dependency sounds very different once the emergency is over. After we hung up, I walked slowly through my house turning off lights room by room. Margaret's chair still sat beside the living room window exactly where she left it before the cancer treatment started. I never moved it. That night, for the first time since helping Daniel save his home, I started wondering whether gratitude quietly expires once people regain stability. And whether the people who helped you survive eventually become uncomfortable reminders of who you were when everything fell apart. After that phone call, something changed quietly between us. Not dramatically. That would have almost been easier. Instead, everything became overly polite. Careful. Managed. Daniel started texting before every visit now. "Hey Dad, just checking if you're planning to stop by today." At first glance, it sounded considerate. But eventually I realized what it really meant. Scheduling. Monitoring. Containment. And the worst part was how quickly I adapted to it. I started replying with exact times. Started apologizing if I stayed too long. Started bringing smaller gifts for Sophie because suddenly I worried every act of generosity might look like another attempt to emotionally buy space inside their family. Humiliation changes people quietly. It teaches you how to shrink yourself before anyone directly asks you to. 2 weeks later Sophie had her piano recital. I almost didn't go. Not because I was angry. Because humiliation changes the way you enter rooms. You start wondering whether people feel relieved when you leave them. The recital took place inside a small community arts center downtown. Rain covered the sidewalks outside while parents crowded into folding chairs holding flowers and phones. When I walked inside, Daniel immediately spotted me near the entrance. And for one split second, genuine panic crossed his face. Not happiness. Not surprise. Panic. Then he recovered quickly. "Dad. You made it." Made it. Interesting phrase. Like my attendance had become uncertain enough to require confirmation. Emily noticed me a second later. Her smile appeared instantly. Warm. Controlled. Thin around the edges. "Hi," she said softly. Not rude. Worse. Socially perfect. That's the problem with quiet resentment. It rarely looks cruel in public. I handed Sophie the small bouquet of flowers I bought on the way there. She hugged me immediately. Real hugs always feel different from adult conversations. No calculation. No management. No emotional accounting. Then Emily crouched beside Sophie and adjusted her dress carefully. "Don't squeeze Grandpa too hard," she said lightly. "He gets tired easily." Something about the sentence bothered me instantly. Not the words. The tone. Soft. Smiling. Public. Like weakness had quietly become part of how she introduced me now. Daniel heard it too. I saw it in his face. But he still said nothing. That hurt more than Emily ever could. I sat near the back row during the recital. Not because I wanted to. Because Daniel guided me there automatically. "Probably easier for you getting out afterward," he explained. Easier. Another harmless word that somehow left bruises anyway. Halfway through the performance, I noticed something strange. Every family took photos together afterward near the stage. Parents. Grandparents. Flowers. Smiling children. But each time I started moving toward Daniel and Emily after Sophie finished playing, Emily somehow redirected things naturally. Talking to another parent. Helping Sophie with sheet music. Asking Daniel to grab coats from the lobby. Pulling Sophie toward another family for pictures. Not obvious. That was what made it painful. Nobody else in the room would have noticed it. But by the third time it happened, I understood clearly. She was separating me from the image of their family without ever openly saying so. And Daniel was allowing it. After the recital ended, everyone moved toward the lobby for refreshments. I stood near the coffee table stirring powdered creamer into a paper cup when I overheard Emily speaking quietly to another mother nearby. "He's a good person," she said softly. "He just gets too attached." Attached. I stared down into the coffee cup while voices blurred together around me. 3 years ago I refinanced my own house to keep their family from losing theirs. Now I was apparently emotionally over-attached for wanting to feel included in the life I helped stabilize. Then Sophie ran toward me holding her recital certificate. "Grandpa, Mommy says we're taking just immediate family pictures first." Immediate family. Children repeat phrases they don't fully understand. That's what makes them dangerous during adult conflicts. I looked up slowly. Across the lobby, Emily froze the moment she realized Sophie had repeated it out loud. Daniel looked away immediately. And standing there beside the coffee table with rain sliding down the lobby windows behind us, I realized something painful. I wasn't slowly becoming less necessary to them. I was slowly becoming embarrassing. The drive home after the recital felt longer than usual. Rain blurred across my windshield while Sophie's voice kept replaying in my head. Immediate family. Not cruel. That was the part making it hurt so badly. Nobody had screamed at me. Nobody told me to leave. Nobody openly rejected me. They were simply redrawing the edges of their life slowly enough that I would hopefully adjust without forcing them to say it directly. That night I sat alone in my kitchen long after midnight staring at old paperwork spread across my table. Refinancing documents. Mortgage transfer agreements. Bank statements from 3 years earlier. The same signatures that once saved Daniel's house now suddenly felt strangely humiliating to look at. Not because I regretted helping. Because I was starting to realize gratitude has an expiration date people rarely admit exists. The next morning I woke up to a text from Daniel. Dad, quick question. Do you still have copies of the refinance paperwork from when you helped us with the house? I stared at the message for a long time before answering. Why? His response came almost immediately. Just trying to organize some things financially. Organize. Interesting word. Because suddenly every harmless phrase people used around me started sounding dangerous. That afternoon I drove to their house anyway. Not to argue. Not even to confront anybody. I honestly think part of me still hoped I was overreacting. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed something strange. The garage keypad code had changed. At first I thought I entered it wrong. Then wrong again. Then the side garage light switched on and Daniel opened the door from inside. Too quickly. Like he'd been watching through the security camera. His expression changed the moment he saw me standing there. Not surprise. Caught. Dad. Rainwater rolled down my jacket while I stared at the keypad beside the garage. You changed the code. Daniel rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. Emily wanted to update the security settings. Security settings. Another harmless phrase carrying an ugly message underneath it. I looked past him into the garage. My old toolbox still sat against the far wall where I left it during the kitchen renovation 2 years earlier. Except now several cardboard boxes had been stacked in front of it. Not accidentally. Stored over. Buried. Daniel noticed me looking at it. We're reorganizing. Of course they were. Everything lately was. Reorganizing. Managing. Boundaries. Space. Planning. Language designed to make exclusion sound reasonable. Then Sophie appeared behind him holding a tablet. Grandpa. She smiled automatically. Then stopped after looking at Daniel's face. Children notice tension faster than adults think they do. "Can I still show Grandpa my room?" she asked carefully. Still. That word hit harder than the keypad. Because suddenly I understood this conversation had already happened inside the house before I arrived. Daniel stepped outside and quietly closed the garage door behind him. Physical separation. Small. Polite. Deliberate. Rain tapped softly against the driveway while neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally I asked quietly. "Am I making your wife uncomfortable just by existing near this house now?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly. That was answer enough already. But then he said something worse. "She feels like we never really got our life back after the foreclosure." I stared at him in silence. Because suddenly I understood the cruelest part of all this. Every sacrifice I made to help save their family had quietly become part of the reason they could no longer feel independent around me. After that conversation in the driveway, I stopped using my key completely. Not because Daniel asked me to. Because humiliation teaches you how to remove yourself before people officially remove you themselves. I started waiting for invitations. Started texting before calling. Started shortening visits so nobody would have to invent reasons for me to leave early. And the strange part was how quickly everyone adjusted to the new version of me. A quieter version. Smaller. Less present. Like the family had been slowly making room for that transition long before I noticed it happening. 2 Sundays later Daniel invited me over for dinner again. Just family this time. No guests. No birthdays. No celebrations. That alone made me suspicious now. Rain rolled steadily across the windows while Emily carried plates between the kitchen and dining room with the same careful politeness she always used lately. Not warmth. Management. Sophie sat beside me coloring quietly while Daniel poured wine nobody really seemed interested in drinking. The whole house felt tense in that overly controlled way families act when everyone's pretending things are normal. Halfway through dinner, Daniel cleared his throat softly. That sound alone made my stomach tighten. Because men usually do that right before disappointing somebody. "We've been reviewing some financial stuff lately," he said carefully. There it was. Financial stuff. Always vague at first. I kept eating without answering. Emily stared down at her plate. Daniel continued. "The mortgage refinance created some legal complications we probably should have cleaned up earlier." Legal complications. Interesting phrase for. "You helped save our house." I set my fork down slowly. "What kind of complications?" Daniel glanced briefly at Emily before answering. That glance told me everything already. "The bank says your name still appears on part of the refinancing structure." Silence settled across the table. Sophie kept coloring quietly beside me, completely unaware her parents were trying to professionally untangle my existence from their house. Emily finally spoke. "We just want to simplify everything moving forward." Simplify. Another clean word covering something ugly underneath. I looked around the dining room slowly. 3 years earlier I helped build half this room with my own hands after water damage destroyed the original flooring. Daniel and I worked 14-hour days rebuilding it while Emily cried from stress in the kitchen because insurance wouldn't cover enough. Back then, every nail I hammered into these walls felt like protecting my family. Now I was apparently paperwork needing simplification. Then Daniel slid a folder slowly across the table toward me. The moment I saw it, something cold moved through my chest. Documents. Prepared. Organized. Not spontaneous. I opened the folder carefully. Property restructuring forms. Refinancing transfer requests. Liability release paperwork. And one line highlighted neatly in yellow. Primary ownership clarification recommended to avoid future estate confusion. Estate confusion. I stared at the sentence for several long seconds. Then slowly looked up at my son. "You're trying to remove my name from the house." Emily answered too quickly. "It's not like that." But it was exactly like that. Nobody at the table touched their food anymore. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Sophie colored flowers onto a paper placemat, completely unaware that the adults around her were quietly dismantling something much larger than paperwork. Then she looked up innocently and asked, "Grandpa, does this mean you don't live here anymore?" The room went completely silent. Emily froze. Daniel looked down immediately. And sitting there at the dining room table in the house I once helped save, I realized something painful. Children often say the truth long before adults are willing to admit it out loud. Nobody answered Sophie immediately. Rain tapped softly against the dining room windows while the entire table seemed to freeze around one innocent question. "Grandpa, does this mean you don't live here anymore?" Emily recovered first. Her smile appeared instantly. Too quickly. "Of course he doesn't, sweetheart," she said lightly. "Grandpa has his own house." But Sophie frowned. "Then why are you always talking about him leaving?" Silence. Real silence this time. Daniel's face changed immediately. Emily looked completely caught off guard. And suddenly I understood something important. Children hear far more than adults think they do. Sophie looked between all of us nervously now. "I heard Mommy crying about it last week." Emily's voice sharpened slightly. "Sophie." But the damage was already done. Because now the truth was sitting openly at the dinner table where nobody could pretend anymore. Not paperwork. Not legal clarification. Not boundaries. They had been talking about removing me from their daily life long enough for an 8-year-old child to absorb pieces of it. I closed the folder slowly. The sound of paper against wood suddenly felt unbearably loud inside the quiet dining room. Then I looked at Daniel. "Did you ask me here tonight because you wanted to talk to me?" I asked quietly, "or because you wanted signatures?" Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. "That's not fair." Fair. Interesting word. Because fairness usually disappears the moment people start reorganizing relationships around convenience. Emily finally spoke again. "We're trying to move forward as a family." I looked directly at her. "I thought I was family." That landed harder than I expected. Emily's expression shifted instantly. Not anger. Guilt. Because suddenly the entire conversation sounded different once spoken out loud. Sophie looked confused now. "Mommy?" Emily reached for her wine glass but her hand shook slightly before she picked it up. Daniel stared down at the table. Still silent. Still avoiding direct conflict the same way he had been avoiding it for months. And that finally exhausted something inside me. Not emotionally. Physically. I suddenly realized how tired I'd become trying to remain welcome in places where my presence now required negotiation. I pushed the paperwork folder gently back across the table. "I'm not signing anything tonight." Daniel finally looked up. "Nobody's forcing you." No. That was the clever part. Nobody had forced anything. Not the reduced visits. Not the boundaries. Not the emotional distancing. Not the changed garage code. Everything had simply been adjusted slowly enough that resistance would make me look unreasonable. Sophie quietly slid her drawing toward me across the table. It showed stick figures standing in front of a house. One small figure stood farther away from everyone else near the edge of the paper. "That's you," she said softly. I stared at the drawing for several long seconds. Then looked at Daniel. And for the first time since all of this started, I saw it clearly on his face. Not cruelty. Cowardice. Because deep down, he knew exactly what was happening. He just lacked the courage to stop it. Outside, rain rolled steadily across the dark windows while the family dinner slowly collapsed into silence around us. And sitting there in the house I once helped save, I realized something painful. Being unwanted rarely happens all at once. Most of the time, people simply move you farther and farther toward the edge of the picture. Until eventually everyone pretends not to notice you're no longer standing in it at all. I left 20 minutes later. Not dramatically. Nobody yelled. Nobody chased after me. Nobody even mentioned the unfinished dessert sitting untouched in the kitchen. That somehow made everything feel worse. Rain had finally stopped outside, leaving the driveway slick beneath the porch lights while cold wind moved quietly through the trees lining their street. Daniel followed me out to the car. Of course he did. That was his pattern lately. Always waiting until nobody else could hear him before saying what he actually felt. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he shoved both hands into his jacket pockets and looked down at the driveway. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because harder. Interesting word for slowly discovering your role inside your own family had become conditional. I unlocked the car but didn't get in yet. "What exactly is this, Daniel?" He hesitated too long. That hesitation answered more honestly than anything else. Finally he exhaled heavily. "Emily feels like we can't fully move forward while everything still feels tied to the foreclosure years." There it was again. Not. "Your help saved us." Not. "We're grateful." Only. The discomfort of remembering they once needed me. I looked back toward the house. Warm lights glowed softly through the dining room windows while silhouettes moved inside near the kitchen. Family life continuing. Without me. Then Daniel quietly added. "You're always there, Dad." That one landed harder than everything else. Because suddenly I understood the real accusation underneath all the polite language. Not controlling. Not angry. Not intrusive. Present. I had simply remained too emotionally present in the life I once helped rebuild. "I'm your father," I said quietly. "I know." Again. "Always." "I know." "Never." "You're wrong." "Never." She crossed a line. "Just." "I know." Daniel rubbed one hand tiredly across his face. "She wants us to figure things out on our own now." I stared at him for several seconds. Then finally asked the question I should have asked weeks earlier. "And what do you want?" Silence. Long enough that I already knew the answer before he spoke. "I just want peace in my house." My house. Not. Our family. Not. Home. His house. The same house the bank was preparing to take before I refinanced my own retirement to save it. Something inside me finally went still after that. Not anger anymore. Acceptance. Because suddenly I realized I'd spent months trying to preserve closeness with people who were already quietly restructuring their life around less of me. Daniel looked relieved when I didn't argue. That hurt too. Like he expected resistance more than sadness. Then the front door opened behind him. Sophie ran outside barefoot onto the porch before Emily called after her sharply. "Shoes." But Sophie ignored her and ran straight toward me. She wrapped both arms around my waist tightly. "Grandpa, are you still coming to my birthday next month?" Daniel's face changed instantly. Emily froze in the doorway. And suddenly nobody looked prepared for the question except me. I crouched carefully beside Sophie. "Do you want me there?" She frowned immediately. "Of course." Simple. Children love honestly before adults complicate loyalty. I smiled softly and kissed the top of her head. "Then I'll be there." Emily looked away first. Because deep down, even she understood something now. This was no longer really about boundaries. It was about discomfort. The discomfort of living beside someone who permanently reminded them of a version of themselves they wanted to forget. I stood back up slowly and opened the driver's door. Then I looked at Daniel one last time. "You know the strange thing?" I said quietly. His eyes lifted toward mine. "I never once regretted helping you." That finally broke something in his expression. Not defensiveness. Shame. Real shame. Good. Because shame meant somewhere underneath all the management and distancing and polite language. He still understood what this actually was. I drove home alone through wet streets reflecting yellow traffic lights across the windshield. And for the first time since all this started, I stopped asking myself how to stay welcome inside their life. Instead, I started wondering something else entirely. What happens to a family once gratitude quietly turns into resentment? And nobody is brave enough to admit it out loud? Sophie's birthday party happened 3 weeks later. For the first time in years, I arrived exactly at the time written in the text message. Not early. Not to help hang decorations. Not carrying folding tables, extension cords, or toolboxes like I usually did. Just a small gift bag in one hand and a birthday card tucked inside my coat pocket. Rain drifted lightly across the neighborhood while cars lined both sides of the street outside Daniel's house. I sat in my truck for almost a full minute before getting out. Not because I was afraid. Because I finally understood something important. There's a difference between being needed and being welcome. The house looked beautiful inside. Streamers. Cake. Children running through the living room. Emily opened the door when I knocked. And for the first time in months, she looked genuinely uncomfortable around me. Not irritated. Not managed. Ashamed. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi, Emily." For a second, neither of us moved. Then she stepped aside quietly. "Come in." Simple words. But somehow they sounded more honest than every polite conversation we'd had lately. Sophie spotted me almost immediately. "Grandpa." She ran across the living room so fast Emily barely had time to warn her not to slide on the hardwood floors. Then Sophie wrapped herself around me like children do when love still feels uncomplicated. No hesitation. No emotional accounting. No careful boundaries. Just love. I hugged her carefully and handed her the gift bag. She immediately grabbed my hand and started pulling me toward the dining room to show me decorations she helped make herself. And for the first time in weeks, nobody stopped her. Nobody redirected the moment. Nobody quietly repositioned me emotionally. That mattered more than I expected. Daniel appeared near the kitchen a few minutes later. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Like someone who'd finally been left alone long enough with his own choices to hear them clearly. We stood facing each other while children screamed happily somewhere upstairs. Finally he spoke quietly. "I've been meaning to call you." I nodded once. "But you didn't." He looked down immediately. "No." At least that was honest. Silence settled between us for several seconds. Then Daniel said something I honestly never expected to hear. "After you stopped coming around so much." Sophie started asking why the family feels different now. That landed quietly somewhere deep in my chest. Because children notice absence differently than adults do. Adults rationalize. Children just feel it. Daniel rubbed one hand slowly across the back of his neck. "I think somewhere along the way," he said quietly, "we started treating your help like pressure instead of love." There it was. Finally. Not boundaries. Not space. Not paperwork. Truth. I looked toward the dining room where Sophie sat laughing beside Emily while showing her birthday cards. Then I answered honestly. I probably stayed too emotionally involved after things stabilized. Daniel shook his head immediately. No, he said softly. You stayed family. That one almost broke me. Because it was the first time in months somebody inside that house finally said the thing I'd actually been grieving the entire time. Not access. Not keys. Belonging. Emily walked slowly into the kitchen carrying a tray of cupcakes. She hesitated before speaking. We kept trying to create independence, she said quietly. But somewhere along the way, I think I started treating closeness like obligation. Nobody answered immediately after that. Rain rolled softly against the kitchen windows while warm light filled the house around us. Not perfect. Not magically healed. Just honest for once. And honestly was enough. Later that evening, I stood outside beside my truck preparing to leave when Sophie ran after me again and wrapped both arms tightly around my waist. Grandpa, she whispered, you can still come over whenever you want. I smiled softly. Then looked up toward Daniel and Emily standing quietly together in the doorway behind her. No, I said gently. From now on, I'll come when we actually want to see each other. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately after that. Because deep down, he understood the difference. I kissed the top of Sophie's head and watched her run back toward the house while cold night air drifted through the wet street around us. Then I stood there alone beside my truck for a moment looking at the warm lights glowing through their windows. And for the first time in months, I stopped trying to figure out how to remain emotionally necessary inside someone else's life. Because sometimes the most painful part of humiliation isn't rejection. It's realizing you kept offering love to people who had already started reorganizing their life around less of you. I drove home slowly through rain-soaked streets reflecting yellow traffic lights across the windshield. And strangely enough, I no longer felt angry. Just clear. Because dignity begins the moment you stop forcing yourself to stay where your presence has quietly become conditional. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records. And before you go, tell me honestly. Have you ever realized too late that your presence in someone's life had quietly become conditional? Or do you think the father stayed too emotionally involved for too long?